It was a big week in the Kopp household because on Thursday, our oldest daughter, Faith, turned 13 years old. And so we did what you do during the lockdown for birthdays. We had a birthday parade for her where a bunch of folks drove up and down the street. And then later on, we got a new bike rack, put that on the back of the minivan, drove to a local park, and then up driving a few miles and ended the day watching a home movie back when Faith was just a year and a half old. And here's actually a picture of her at that time in her life. And I just think that captures her so well in that age range. You know, I remember when she was that age, parents who had kids in college at the time said to Kelly and I, don't blink because they grow up so fast. And at the time, I honestly didn't believe them. But now that I have a 13-year-old in our house, I absolutely do believe that. So it was a great way to spend her birthday. And I want to take this opportunity as well to say thank you to Faith, because this is the 12th sermon that we have been inside of an empty sanctuary, and she has been part of a very small team. It's typically her, myself, and then Tony, and then sometimes Brad as well, 3 or 4 of us who are at the building every weekend. And Faith has volunteered to be on our slideshow team every single one of these sermons. She's done a great job. So a huge reason why you're able to see the slides, like the picture that you just saw of her, as well as the Bible verses and the key thoughts, is because of our awesome daughter, Faith Sophia. So thank you, Faith. Now, before we open up the scriptures, I wanted to say this. In addition to going to church online this weekend, I really hope that you carve out some time to spend some time in prayer, thanking God that we live in America, and that you just thank God for that, to know that freedom, again, it's a cliche, but it's not a cliche. Freedom does not come for free. And that this weekend that you would take some time perhaps to pray and to thank those who are on the front lines of the current battle that we're in against the invisible enemy of the coronavirus, and just say thank you to the nurses and the doctors and the first responders that are just going out there and really being on the front lines, being that tip of the spear. And to take this time as well to pray for those in our government, in our state, and across the country for just wisdom and discernment on how to navigate this and how to get us on the other side as we navigate the new normal. So just please be praying. Please be praying for America. That being said, I want to now switch gears and introduce the main topic for today. And here's a key thought. While no one could imagine waking up on December the 26th and thinking, isn't Christmas around this time of the year? It's common to do exactly that when it comes to the holidays of the Ascension and Pentecost. Ascension Day was this past Thursday, May the 21st, and the day of Pentecost is next Sunday, May the 31st. So in addition to May 21st being Faith's birthday for our family, it's actually a big day on the Christian calendar worldwide. It's a holiday because it marks the 40th day after Easter. It marks the ascension of Jesus, where he left earth and went back to heaven. So this past Thursday, again, May the 21st, was the actual holiday on the church calendar. But the powers that be who kind of set the calendar know that when churches aren't under a lockdown, Thursdays aren't like a big going to church kind of day. So they usually choose to celebrate the following Sunday, which is Ascension Sunday. And that is what we're celebrating this weekend. And as I prayed into it, and those events that happened 2,000 years ago on the day Jesus ascended into heaven, those events perfectly set up what I planned to preach on today as we wrap up our series on spiritual pathways today, and how the Ascension and this Pathway series comes together will become very clear as I preach. So here's a passage that describes those events 2,000 years ago. Jesus rises from the dead, and then he walks the earth for 40 days. And we pick things up in Acts chapter 1 in the 5th verse. It says, on one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command. Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Then they gathered around him and asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? But he said to them, it's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Now, they probably assumed that conversation would continue. They probably thought that day would just be like the previous 40 days after Jesus rose from the dead. So what happened next had to have shocked them. Here's the very next verse, verse 9 of Acts 1. After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid them from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. So Jesus starts to rise up, and he keeps going up until they can't see him anymore. And these followers of Jesus, they had no grid for this. This was not on their plan of what was going to happen that day. So they keep looking up, probably waiting for Jesus to come back down. So 2 angels arrive on the scene. They basically say, hey, if you are going to be waiting for Jesus to come back and you're going to look up until he comes back, you're going to have like a really, really bad crick in your neck, because it's going to be a while until he returns. So Jesus is coming back. But between now and then, we need to do much more than just wait around and stare up at the clouds. Now, before I talk about what we need to do between now and when Christ comes back, I want to fast forward to 1 week from today. Again, as believers and followers of Jesus, we believe in the second coming of Christ. And we know that the second coming will be the end of the world as we know it. And so on that note, next Sunday, we're going to launch a new series that I really feel is the perfect series for the greater conversations that are going on around the world right now. And it's this new series launches next Sunday. Are we living in the end times? I have personally been asked that question a handful of times over the past few months. Are we living in the end times? With everything going on in our world right now. And so in this new series, we're going to tackle that question as well as a host of other questions head on. For example, is the coronavirus pandemic prophesied in the book of Revelation? Is the Antichrist already in power somewhere in the world? Is the second coming of Christ about to happen? So that's where we're headed starting next weekend in this new series, which also is the day of Pentecost. So perfect time to preach on these topics. So going back to this weekend, which is Ascension Sunday, what are we supposed to be doing between now and the return of Christ? There are a number of ways to answer that question, but I wanted to answer it in a way that ties into the series that we have been in. And so to answer that question of what are we supposed to be doing can be found in this quote that I shared in week 1 of this series. So going back a few weeks to this quote from John Ortberg in his book, Soul Keeping. He said, God made the whole earth so that he would have a place to be with man and woman, you and me. The garden that God created represented his great desire for being with. For the soul to be well, it needs to be with God. And I love this thought that the reason why God created not just the Garden of Eden, but the entire planet, was that so he would have a physical place to be with us. Now, before the ascension, it was easy for the disciples to be with God because Jesus walked the earth. So to be with God back then, you simply had to be with Jesus, to join him where he was going as he walked across the Holy Land. So it was very easy to be with God 2,000 years ago. But since the ascension, we still need to be with God, but it looks very different in how we do that. And that's where this series comes into play. Again, we're in week 4 of a series on spiritual pathways. And the main idea of this pathway is that God has wired us uniquely. He wants us to be with him, to connect with him, to abide in him in various ways. And the truth is, the way that I best connect with God may not be the way that you best connect with God. So 20 years ago, I came across a book that focused on what I just said again, the fact that the way I best connect with God may not be the way that you best connect with him. It's the book Sacred Pathways from Gary Thomas. It's your pastor's pick, not just for this week, but for this entire series. And the author did extensive study and research, and he realized that there are about 10 of what he calls sacred or spiritual pathways, 10 unique ways that people draw near to God. So in this series, I've been sharing each of these 10 pathways and inviting you to walk on them, to try them out, to encounter and to experience God in new ways. Ways that aren't truly new, but just new for us. They're ancient ways. They're ancient paths that often go untraveled in the American version of Christianity. So far in this series, I've covered 8 of them, and I have 2 more to go. And so that's what I'm going to do today. But in addition to covering those final 2 pathways, I'm also going to share some other pitfalls, some errors, or ways that we misinterpret these pathways or don't understand them. So I'm going to give you those as well as some action steps about how to apply this sermon, not just this sermon, but to put this entire series into practice, so that this summer will be what the title of this sermon is, that it will be a summer of life. That it will be a summer of life when it comes to your spiritual journey. And just one more thing, by the way, if you are new to our church, thanks so much for checking us out. Whether you're brand new to our church or you've been coming for a while, I pray that you encounter God through this sermon, through the worship experience, through communion, through prayer today. That you get equipped with some tools, some practical tools to grow in your faith so that you can grow in your faith and then engage the world with the love of God. That's our passion. So here is the first pathway I want to unpack today. It's intellectuals. And intellectuals, this pathway, draw near to God through their minds. Now, I'm not a huge fan with how this one is named because it implies that you need to be super smart in order to walk on this pathway, but that's actually not true. It simply means that you primarily connect with God through your mind. So if this is one of your top pathways, it doesn't mean you're like Einstein. And if this one is, say, at the bottom of your list, say 8th, 9th, or 10th place when you took the assessment, it doesn't mean that the Forrest Gumps of the world could beat you in an IQ test. It doesn't mean that either. Here's a quote that unpacks this. Intellectuals are likely to be studying and in some places arguing either for or against doctrines like Calvinism, infant baptism, and predestination. They feel closest to God when they first understand something new about him. And a passage that describes intellectual pathway is in Mark chapter 12. Of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all of your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. That is the greatest commandment. And part of the greatest commandment is to love God with your mind. So what we say at the mission is blind faith is not biblical faith. That God gave us a mind to reason with him, to ask tough questions, to understand both what you believe and why you believe what you believe, not to have a blind faith. And so this is an aspect, again, the great commandment is for everybody, and the intellectual pathway focuses on that part of loving God with your mind. This is my number one pathway. It describes me to a T. Early on in my spiritual journey, I discovered the wonderful world of Christian authors and books. I've always loved to read. That's something how God just made me. I remember growing up, going to Salk Elementary over in across town and reading Encyclopedia Brown books as like a 3rd and 4th grader. and then reading the Choose Your Own Adventure series of books, and then James Bond novels when I got a little bit older. Just love to read. Now, when I started going back to church in my 20s, every time a pastor would quote from a book or they'd point one out in their sermon, I would go to the bookstore and I would buy it. Back when the only way that you could buy a book was actually getting in your car and driving to a bookstore, which is a world that my kids never knew. So when I started going back to church in my 20s, pretty soon my number one hobby became reading Christian books, not just books in general, but books about God, the Bible, theology. And I would read every single day, and that is still true to this day, 20 years later. So here are two ways to take a walk on this pathway, on the intellectual pathway. The first way to walk on it is to read the book and other books. When I talk about reading the book, that's the Bible. And I would encourage you to buy a good study Bible, make that investment, and this is not a place to cheap out. Like, buy a good one. On the back of your program every single week, we always point out a number of Bibles. The Quest Study Bible is a great option. There's also the Teen Life Application Study Bible, Kids Quest. There's other study Bibles as well. I encourage you to purchase one of those. Read the book and have a plan to read it every single day. When our building is open, we have a Bible reading plan handout that gives you a few plans to follow. So I'd encourage you to pick one of those up when our building opens back up. So read the book, but also read other books. On the back of your program every single week, there are books that I love to recommend to have you dig deeper into the sermon of the day. So the back of your program is a great tool and resource to use to help you walk on this pathway. Now, when it comes to reading those other books, here's another way to walk on this pathway. Here's the way that I framed it. Stretch your theology. Stretch your theology. Now, what I'm about to say is true with what we believe about God, and it's true with what we believe about the coronavirus as well. See, what we tend to do is we tend to fill our minds only with people whose opinions and voices we already agree with. And we tend to block out things and people that see things in a different way. When we read books, we tend to read, and it makes sense, to read from authors that you like, authors that you agree with. My challenge to you is this. Every once in a while, I'm not saying do this all the time, but every once in a while, pick up a book by an author that you don't agree with, that'll stretch your theology. I practice what I preach. Every once in a while, I will pick up a book by an atheist or by other streams of the Christian faith that maybe I don't swim in. I have read books from authors that do not like and are vocal against some of my favorite authors. And I do that to stretch myself to see their side of things. So again, I want to encourage you to do that. Not all the time, but once in a while. Maybe once this summer, buy a book that will stretch you in this way. I have read books by authors that, based on what I saw on the internet, which can be a wasteland, right? I heard through the grapevine, man, I don't know if this guy's a genuine believer by what he says about X, Y, or Z. But I decided, instead of allowing the internet to explain and help me believe what I believe, I decided, and this is a good practice, what does the author himself say firsthand? I don't want to embrace what others say this person believes. I want to hear from them of what they believe. So over the years, I've read dozens of books by authors that I typically don't read. And what I've found again and again and again is, even if I don't swim in the same stream of the Christian faith that I share with this person, they're still a believer. They love the Lord. I'll see them in heaven. They just express themselves in a different way. And again, I could say a ton more about this topic. I'm passionate about it, but I'm going to stop there. So again, with every pathway, I'm giving you a couple ways to walk on the pathway, and then I paint the picture of saying it's like you're walking on a road, and as long as you stay on the road, you're fine. But if you go too far in one direction or the other, you could fall into a ditch. And so with each pathway, here's a ditch that we want you to avoid. And so when it comes to the intellectual pathway, here's the ditch. Don't neglect the book as you read other books. What this means is as you read, don't just read book after book after book by your favorite authors, John Ortberg or whoever else, while your Bible collects dust on your bookshelf, right? So don't neglect the book, the scriptures, as you read other books. So that is your first pathway, intellectual. Here's the next pathway. It's relational. And this pathway draws near to God in community. What's interesting about this pathway is it was not in the original edition of the Sacred Pathways book. It wasn't in there. It actually is in the updated version, but the author has it actually as a subset of the enthusiast pathway. So I'm guessing that Gary Thomas, the author, is probably an introvert. So he doesn't think in these terms. But even if you're introverted, like I am, we need to walk on this pathway. The truth is, it is a spiritual pathway, and it is a key way that believers have connected with God since the beginning, through relationships, through community. So here's a passage that describes the early church. And the early church, again, right after the ascension happened and believers started to gather together, as it describes the early church in Acts chapter 2, notice that it doesn't say everybody had a quiet time reading the Bible by themselves and praying all alone. Instead, here's what the early church did in Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. It says all the believers were together and they had everything in common, selling all their goods and possessions. They gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to the number daily those who were being saved. It's a beautiful picture of the early church where they lived out their faith together. So here are some ways to walk on this pathway. Number one is to go old school and pick up the phone. This actually was an action step a few sermons ago, but I wanted to circle back to it because there is this thing called the lost art of the phone call. Again, back when I was growing up and the only way you could buy a book was to drive to a bookstore, the only way you could talk to somebody back then was to pick up a telephone that was attached to the wall, right? And over time, we've kind of lost that. So let's go old school. And so I'd love for each of you watching this to think of people you know at church, people that you miss seeing on Sundays, and pick up the phone and talk to them. And if you don't have their phone number, but you have their email address, send them an email to get their phone number to give them a call. If you know them well enough, if you're good friends, don't just ask, how are you doing? But ask, how is your soul doing? How are you in the deepest part of you doing? Now, I'm not saying to ask that question to every single person you talk to, but to ask it to the people that you know well. But even those who you don't know all that well, pick up the phone, give them a call, check in on them, see how they're doing. The more phone calls, the better. So call people in your small group, call people that you volunteer with, call people that you barely know all that well, and just pick up the phone and enter into community that way. So that's the first way to walk on this pathway. The second way is to do small in new ways. To do small in new ways. Our church has had small groups since we launched back in 2010. But with the building being shut down, our church and every other church across the country is in the process of rethinking how to do old things in new ways. And one of them are small groups and the idea of taking them online. So here's one example of how some folks in our church are leading the charge in doing this. And this one example shows the possibilities that this has. Mike and Archner Bridges, awesome couple at our church. They launched an online small group that focuses on ways to pray. And they use Zoom to meet online so everybody can see each other in small little computer squares or small little squares on their screen. It's like the Brady Bunch kind of thing, if you ever did a Zoom meeting or a Google Meet. In their first gathering, they had 25 people, which is actually a very big small group. They would not have actually been able to fit 25 people in their living room, but they could do it in a virtual way. And what was really fun about it was where people joined them from. I talked to them, and what they said was a number of them were from the Mission Church. But there was other folks who aren't connected to the mission, but they're part of our local area in Michigan. But in addition to Michigan, there were people from Virginia and another state in the South. I don't remember where it was. There was even people from countries. They had someone from Canada, someone from Brazil, someone from Argentina. So this is like multiple continents going on in a small group. And all this was taught, by the way, live by a fellow pastor in the Vineyard Movement from Oklahoma. How cool is that? So this small group gives us a vision of the possibility of what online small groups can do. So right now our team is brainstorming on ways to make more small groups like this one happen. And even when our building opens back up, this is a great way to continue to do small groups. By the way, we're having this conversation of really having a dual approach. We're having things go on as we always do in the building, like we always have, but then also having a dual approach where there's some things to offer online at the same time and kind of do them both at the same time. And so we are brainstorming right now. And an easy way, by the way, if you're thinking, hey, I would love to do that, and it's simply hosting. It's hosting the group. You can go through the questions that dig deeper that are in the program every single week. This is a small group curriculum built in. I write these questions tied to the sermon, and you simply can host a group, invite everyone you know, post on your Facebook wall or other ways, and then we can help you, by the way, with the technology to figure out how to do something like a Zoom or a Google Meet. So if you're interested in hosting a online small group, Ann is our small groups coordinator, and her email, if we could put that back up on the screen just real quick, annbuyer@aol.com. Reach out to her. She's our awesome small groups coordinator, and we will help get you set up to do this. So please consider that. So one landmine to avoid, this is the way that I phrase it. When it comes to this pathway, the goal is not Friends or Seinfeld. It's the Avengers or the Lord of the Rings. Here's what I mean by that. Those two TV shows consisted of a group of people that loved to hang out, but if you watch those shows, that's basically all they did was hang out. In contrast to the characters in those movies, they consist of a group of people that had a strong relational connection as well. But they were together not just to hang out, but for a greater good, a greater purpose. So when it comes to the spiritual pathway, it's not just about hanging out. It's about building friendships and transforming the world together. So that wraps up our 10th and final pathway. Took me 3 sermons to get through all 10, but we did it. But I'm not done yet. Actually, I have a lot more to preach on. I would like to switch gears now and press into pathways from a different angle. Look at the misconception. Easy for me to say. I'm not even going to try to say that again. But the errors, the mistakes, the misinterpretations of spiritual pathways. So here's the first misconception. Everyone should have the same spiritual pathway that I have. Now, we might not say that out loud, but we think it. Or maybe you're not even aware that you're thinking it. It's just something that we assume. That everyone should have the same spiritual pathways that I have. We judge people all the time, where we assume that what we like and how we are wired are the way that everybody's wired, or at least the way everybody should be wired. So when it comes to entertainment choices, right, if you love a certain movie or you think another movie was a waste of time, many times you are shocked when you hear someone has the opposite opinion. And they're obviously wrong, right? When it comes to food, the toppings that you prefer on your pizza should be the only toppings available, right, on pizza. And when it comes to our spiritual journey, we think that the way we connect with God is the right way to connect with God. So when you look at the 10 spiritual pathways, If you are an enthusiast, if that is one of your top pathways, and so during the worship set at church, your hands are in the air and you are singing at the top of your lungs, then you glance over and you may see someone who's seated and they have like their head in their hands maybe, or they're kneeling down. You might be tempted to question if they're a Christian, when in reality, maybe they're simply a contemplative and they are worshiping with God. They're entering into worship as a contemplative. Maybe a traditionalist is number 10 on your pathway assessment. So you hear somebody go to midnight mass on Christmas Eve and be excited about it, and it doesn't compute in your language because you're not a traditionalist. So again, that's a misconception that everybody should have the same spiritual pathways that I have. Here's the second one. I don't like my spiritual pathway or my top 3. I wish I had different ones. So when you took the assessment and you got the results, maybe you didn't like them. You might be an activist. That might be like your top 3. But you might think that the real spiritual people are the intellectuals, the ones that know their Bible really, really well. Or maybe you're an intellectual, but you wish you were an enthusiast. You wish that you had the joy of the Lord like enthusiasts do. And on and on and on. What you need to know is that God wired you. He didn't make a mistake. You are made the way you are by God for a reason. And there's no spiritual pathway that's better than any other. God has made you to connect with Him intentionally. So press into the pathways that you have, walk on them. Walk on the pathways that God made you to walk on. With that being said, here's the third misconception. I should never engage in a spiritual pathway that didn't make my top 3. Now, here's what I will say. You should primarily engage and walk on the pathways that are in your top 3 because those are the ways that God wired you up. But don't look at the list. Here's something that's so important. Don't look at the list, at your top 10 when you took the assessment and say, you know what? To make this a summer of life, I'm going to spend my entire summer walking on pathways in 8th, 9th, and 10th place. Don't do that. Again, your primary pathway or pathways are the way that God wired you. They're the natural ways for you to draw near to God and connect with Him. But that being said, again, don't fall in the trap of being a legalist about your pathway. So like a friend buys you a Christian book for your birthday and you say, thank you, but I'm not an intellectual. Thanks, but no thanks. Or maybe you get invited to a Christian concert. And you say, no, I'll pass. I'm not an enthusiast like you are. Or maybe someone invites you to join their small group and they're like, you know what? I'm not into the whole connection community. I'm an introvert, That's thanks, but no thanks. Or maybe a friend invites you to volunteer at the Friends of Foster Kids or at Samaritan's House Food Pantry or McRest. And you say, you know what? I'm not an activist. I don't need to put my faith in action. Don't fall into those traps. Again, the misconception, I should never engage in a spiritual pathway that didn't make my top 3. Here's the fourth and final one. The spiritual pathway assessment is the final word on what my top pathways are. For those of you who took the test, and at the end of the sermon, I'm going to point it out again in case you didn't get a chance to take it, to have you have one final chance to do that. Just a few quick things about that pathways assessment. It was not inspired by God. It's simply a starting point. It's not the be-all, end-all. But it does point you in a direction. The best way, though, to figure out what your primary pathway, your top pathway, as well as your top 3 are, is start walking on them according to how you scored on the test. In reality, as you walk on the pathways, maybe the one that you scored in 3rd place is actually your top pathway. It's just that you answered a few questions, maybe one way, and you skewed the data a little bit. Or maybe you have a few pathways that are tied for 4th place, and maybe one of those is actually in your top 3. So the best way to understand what your pathways are is to start walking on them and see how you connect with God, see how you encounter and experience God. So those are 4 of the misconceptions about spiritual pathways. Now I'd like to switch gears one more time in my message and give you some action steps. Not just for this sermon, but for this entire summer. Again, with the hope that if you put these 4 action steps into practice, that this will be a summer of life for you. So here is the first of the 4 action steps to take over this summer. Number 1, learn everything you can about your pathways. Now, I'm hoping that most of you have already taken the assessment, but even by taking the assessment, there's still work to do. Here, by the way, is the link. If you did not have a chance to take the assessment yet over the past month, this is the last week it'll be available, and there'll be a button under the online church experience option where you can click on it and take it. It'll take you maybe 10 to 20 minutes tops, and it'd be, again, a very helpful tool. But even after you take the assessment and you understand in order ranked from 1 to 10, you're not done yet. I, again, want this to be as practical and as personal as possible. So I think taking the assessment would be a great thing to do. On the back of the program as well is a summary of the 10 pathways just in a sentence form. So this will point you in a direction as well. But I'd love for you to learn everything you can about your pathways. Now, please don't think that this series, even though it was 4 sermons long, is enough. The more you learn, the better. Now, that's coming from an intellectual, but there's truth in that. Be a student of this. Learn what you can about your top pathways. And so with that being said, here are 3 great options to do that. And these are on the back of your program as well. The book from Gary Thomas, Sacred Pathways, John Ortberg's book, The Me I Want to Be, and then a series by Andy Stanley, You've Got Style. Now, if you are an intellectual, you'll do all 3. But I'm not saying you need to do that. But I do invite you to become a student, to learn more, because I just touched on these pathways. There's more to learn, much more to learn, more landmines to avoid, and more ways to walk on each pathway. So I would invite you this summer to learn everything you can about your pathways. The next step to take this summer is to walk regularly on your top pathways. As I've shared in this series, there is a difference, a big difference between knowing the path and walking the path. So even if you know your top pathways, the question is, are you walking on them? So I invite you, get out your weekly calendar, get out your monthly calendar, get out your summer calendar, and figure out a plan of how you are going to walk on your top pathways. And don't just do it once to check off a box. Do them in a regular way because, again, Jesus is the vine. We are the branches. We need to abide to connect to him. And the way we do that, the way we are with God between the ascension and the second coming, are spiritual pathways. That's the way to abide and be with God. A third way to walk, or a third step to take this summer, is to appreciate all the pathways. Appreciate all of them. You need to realize that your pathways, your top pathways, very well may change depending on the season of life that you are in. So, for example, again, intellectual has always been my number one pathway, but for the 3 years that I was out in California going to seminary, I was engaging God with my mind for like 8 to 10 hours a day. And so when it was time for me to connect, to abide in the vine in Jesus, to draw near to God, not for school, but just for my personal connection and personal growth, loving God with my mind was the last thing I wanted to do. The last thing I wanted to do was to read a Christian book, because I was doing that all week long. So during that season of my life, I needed to walk on other pathways in order to draw near and connect with God. So the first thing you need to know is to appreciate all the pathways, knowing that your pathways may change depending on the season that you're in. You also need to understand that God can and he will use every pathway if you're open to it. He can and he will use every pathway if you're open to it. So a few sermons ago, I talked about how I was down at Andy Stanley's church at the Drive Conference. And I was invited during the worship set to walk on the enthusiast pathway with that song, with the lyrics, "Hold me in the arms that made the universe," and how those words wrecked me as Todd Field sang them. And I could have missed it if I was stuck in the rut of my intellectual pathway. Just can't wait for Andy to preach. Who cares about the worship, right? I would have missed a holy moment. I would have missed just an amazing connection and encounter and experience with God through the enthusiast pathway. So you need to know all the pathways, be willing to walk on them, even in the moment as the opportunities present themselves. Fourth and final step to take this summer is to help others identify their pathways. One of the best things you can do is to help others identify their spiritual pathways. Friends that you know that maybe don't know this concept, or maybe people you call on the phone this week, you see how they're doing, how's your soul doing? And they talk about being in a desert, being in a valley, feeling stuck on their spiritual journey. Introduce them to this concept. Point out these sermons to them. Share what you have learned. But this is so important. As you share it, be careful not to invite them to walk on your pathways. Again, they aren't you. So invite them to learn, to take the test themselves, to walk on every pathway the way that God wired them up. Well, as we wrap up, I have some final thoughts on how to make this a summer of life when it comes to spiritual pathways, but I want to press the pause button for a moment and to do something I've done every single week for these past 12 weeks that we've been in an empty sanctuary. And I've done this every week as part of my sermon because it matters that much, and it's about giving to the church. Thank you for those of you who are continuing to give, to be generous, to be so faithful in that. Thank you, because you are helping make church happen. Unprecedented is the buzzword of the past few months. Uncertainty still going on. So because of that, we thank you for your faithfulness and your generosity, for your tithes and offerings. When you give, the money you give, that really is the fuel that makes church happen. When you give, you allow more people to encounter God, to get equipped, so they can engage the world. So we have a slide on the screen here that are ways to give, either by going old school and mailing a check, and thanks to those of you who do that, as well as anybody who wants to give online in a safe, secure, and easy way. As we've said it, and it's true, our church is not closed, just our building is. And on that note, please know we are having active conversations with our building task force right now. Every single week we're meeting. There's tons of emails going on outside of those meetings about when to reopen the building. And my hope and prayer is that, first of all, it will happen real soon. We want to do it in the safest way possible, in the best way possible. And when we open up, we want to be in the strongest position from a financial perspective possible so that we can really hit the ground running and just press into God more and what he has for us at the mission. So thank you for giving to the mission. So again, the sermon today is called Summer of Life. And here's a question for you. Monday of this week is the unofficial start of summer. That's Memorial Day, right? Now, normally, at this time of the year, most years, we would have our plans for vacation mapped out. We would know where we're going and when we were going there. Now, of course, that is not the case this year, where probably most of us have no plans for what we're doing this summer because we're not sure what we'll be able to do just yet. So most of us have no plan for the summer. And the same, unfortunately, is true oftentimes when it comes to our spiritual journey and our spiritual growth. I want you to think about how many of you have a plan for spiritual growth this summer, about how you're going to connect, draw near to God, to grow in your faith. By the way, what I'm preaching today, it's not just for the grown-ups. This is for kids. If you're in the first grade and 10th grade and college, do you have a spiritual plan? What are some things that you plan to do to keep your spiritual temperature hot all summer long? Now, if you don't have a plan, my goal is to invite you to use spiritual pathways. That's why we did this series at this point. We're wrapping up just as summer begins to have you equipped with these tools of spiritual pathways. And so I invite you to spend some time over this holiday weekend, come on up with your plan. Your plan of how you are going to learn everything you can about the pathways. Again, maybe you decide as part of your summer reading to pick up the Sacred Pathways book by Gary Thomas. Be a great thing to do. So what's your plan? to learn everything you can about your pathways, about God, how God has wired you up. And then what is your plan to walk regularly on your top pathways again and again all summer long? What is your plan to appreciate all the pathways? Maybe by trying all of them out, maybe one pathway a week all summer long. Just trying things out and being open to encounter and experience God in new ways. Not new ways in general, just new ways to you. These are ancient paths that often go untraveled. And as you are on this journey, as you're building your plan, what is your plan to help others find their pathways? Talking to your friends, talking to your kids, talking to your parents, talking to those in your small group, helping together others find their pathways. I want to invite you to do that. And if you do these things, if you say, you know what, I'm not just going to be a hearer of this word, I'm going to be a doer of it. I'm going to create my plan. If you do that, regardless of what happens with the coronavirus and the lockdowns and all that that's going on, if you do this, if you press into spiritual pathways this summer, I believe this will be a summer of life for you.